We continue now at the top of Daf Kuf Zayin Amud Aleph and Meseches Zevachim. This is Zevachim Daf 107a. The Gemara continues with another answer. What is the source for the Azhara, for the warning by Shchutei Chutz, by slaughtering Kachim outside of the Beis HaMikdash? Rava says, Kid Rabbi Yonah. It's like Rabbi Yonah says, the Amar Rabbi Yonah, because Rabbi Yonah says, Asya Sham Sham. We learn it out, Sham Sham. And this is a reference to the pasuk. The pasuk says, "Ki'im b'makom asher yivchar Hashem bi'achad shivotecha sham ta'ala olosecha v'sham ta'ase kol asher anochi mitzavecha." So it talks about sham ta'ala olosecha. That's where you offer up your carbon ola, and then it says sham ta'ase kol asher anochi mitzavecha. That refers to all the other parts of the procedure of the karbonos. And we say malahalan lo anash ala imkain hizir, just like over there, there's no punishment without a warning. There's a warning as well. Afkan soto over here lo anash ala imkain hizir. There is no punishment unless there is a warning. Rashi explains Hachi Garsinan Damar Rabbi Yonah Amar Kra Sham Tala Olosecha v'Sham Tase Iskish Shar Asios Lahala. Rashi understands this is not a Gzera Shava, but a Hekish. It's in the same pasuk. We compare all the other parts of the procedure to the offering up. Mahalo Lo Anash Ala Imkain Hizir. Just like by offering up, it's not a punishment. There's no punishment without a warning. The warning is there as well. Av Shchita Sotu, by slaughtering outside the Beis HaMikdash, Lo Anash Ela Imkain Hizir. There's not a punishment unless there's a warning together with it, and that is the source of the warning. And the Gemara continues, Eshkechon Mukterei Pnim. So according to this, we find a source. Let's say it was slaughtered in the Mikdash, Shehelon Lachutz, and then it was offered up outside the Beis HaMikdash. That we have a source for a warning for. But Mukterei Chutz, Shehelon Lachutz Minayin, from where do we know? Let's say it was slaughtered outside the Beis HaMikdash and then offered outside the Beis HaMikdash. Where do we have a source for that? Rashi explains, Eshkechon Mukterei Bifnim Shehelon Bachutz means as follows. Shchutei Pnim, it was slaughtered inside the Mikdash. Shayu Omdim Lahaktir Bifnim, meaning it was ready to be offered inside the Mikdash. V'helu Bachutz, and then it was offered outside the Mikdash. So Chayiv, so there we understand your Chayiv. K'dechsiv b'hala, because that's what's written by the offering up. It says, V'al Pesach Ol Moed Lo Yivenu. It says he didn't bring it where he should have brought it. He didn't bring it to the entrance of the Ol Moed. So Beru'uyin L'haviyan Lefnim, it means to say it was fit to be brought inside, Ulhalosan, and offered up over there. Hakasa Medaber. That's what the pasuk is talking about. But Mukderei Chutz, Shchutei Chutz, let's say it was slaughtered outside. She'omdin Liktar Bachutz V'lo Bifnim. There, it can only be offered outside the Mikdash, not inside the Mikdash. How do we know if that's offered up outside the Beis HaMikdash? Where do we know the warning for that? And the Gemara continues and answers, Amar Rav Kahana. Rav Kahana says, Amar Krutz, because the pasuk says, Va'alehem Tomar. It says, Va'alehem Tomar in the pasuk. The full pasuk is, Va'alehem Tomar ish mi Beis Yisrael, umin hager asher yagur b'sochem asher yala ola ozavach. It says somebody who's going to offer up a carbon. Rashi here explains, Va'alehem Tomar, Zeu Tchilas Parshas Hala. This is the beginning of the parsha that talks about offering up the karbanos. Usmucho leParshas Shchutei Chutz, and it is near the parsha of Shchutei Chutz. Al Harishonim demishtoi b'Shchutei Chutz, and so therefore it's going on what was said earlier. We're talking about Shchutei Chutz. It's slaughtered outside the Mikdash, and saying Sha'amar she'imhelu b'Chutz, and those in such a situation, if it was slaughtered outside the Mikdash and then offered outside, Chayiv, that's what the person is liable on. V'alehem karinan, and we read it as V'alehem with an ayin. It means to say it's in reference to that, and so therefore we see a punishment again in this situation. Let's say it was slaughtered outside the Beis HaMikdash. We see that for being offered up as well. And the Gemara continues and says, Al Hasmuchin Tomar, it's going on what is nearby. Again, as we just said, this is the beginning of that parsha, and therefore it's going on that. But the Gemara continues, Maskif lo Rava. Rava asks on this, Miksiv Va'alehem, does it say, is it written Va'alehem with an ayin? Va'alehem Ksiv, it doesn't say Va'alehem with an ayin, it says Va'alehem with an aleph, and so therefore this is not a good source. Rashi explains Va'alehem Ksiv Lashon Kushihu. This is all part of the question. And so the Gemara says, Ella rather Kedetana de Rabbi Shmuel, it's as was taught in the yeshiva of Rabbi Shmuel, Va'alehem Tomar, when it says Va'alehem Tomar with the Vav is connecting La'arev Parshios, that says that we should combine the Parshios. Rashi explains, Hachi Garsinan Ela Kedetana de Rabbi Shmuel, Va'alehem Tomar La'arev Parshios, Vav Mosef Al Inyan Rishon. The Vav is like connecting the two Parshios. So Ma'arev HaParshios Lomar, it's mixing the Parshios and saying, Sha'av Shchutei Chutz, Shehelon Bachutz Chayiv, that even Shchutei Chutz, even if it was slaughtered outside the Mikdash and then offered outside the Beis HaMikdash, it's Chayiv. Again, that's the source that there's a liability in that situation as well. And the Gemara continues, Rabbi Yochanan Amar, Rabbi Yochanan says, Asya hava hava. We actually learned it from hava hava, which was a drasha we had in the previous Amud. Malahalan mukterei chutz, just like over there, it's mukterei chutz. Again, that's talking about where it was slaughtered outside the mikdash. Afkan mukterei chutz, so too over here, it's slaughtered outside the Beis HaMikdash. And that's the source for liability when it's slaughtered and then offered up outside the Beis HaMikdash. And the Gemara continues, Maskif lo Rabbevi. Rabbevi asks on this, Hadatanan, what about that which we learned in the Mishnah in Krisos? It says, Shloshem v'sheish krisos b'Torah. It says that there are 36 instances of kares in the Torah. Now, really, Tlasin v'shev havyan, isn't there really 37? Deika hamala v'hamala, because now again we have this source that there's really two liabilities by offering up outside the Beis HaMikdash. There's offering up outside the Beis HaMikdash when it was slaughtered in the Beis HaMikdash, and then there's offering up outside the Beis HaMikdash when it was slaughtered outside the Beis HaMikdash. So it should be 37 and not 36. And the Gemara says to that kasha, the Gemara leaves that as a difficulty. And the Gemara continues, V'hadetnan, but what about that which we learned in the Mishnah later on? The Mishnah says, Hazorek mixas damim b'chutz. If somebody throws just some of the blood of the carbon outside the Beis HaMikdash, chayiv, he's liable in that situation for avoda outside of the Beis HaMikdash. Minolan, from where do we learn that? And Rashi explains, V'hadetanan l'kamon b'masnisin, this is later on in the Mishnah, Hazorek mixas damim b'chutz shelo nasan arba matanos. He throws some of the blood outside the mikdash. He doesn't do 4 applications of blood, ela matana achas, just 1 application, chayiv, so he's liable to have a zrika bifnim. In that case, again, if he would have done that kind of zrika inside the mikdash, techevase, that would have been considered a zrika. Tetanan, as we learned in the Mishnah, kol hanitanan al mizbech hachitzon shenesanim b'matana achas kiper. It says, anytime you have applications on the outer mizbech, just 1 matana is going to be an atonement. So the point is, if it's something that would be considered a good zrika inside the mikdash, so if you do that outside the mikdash, then the person is liable. But the question is, minolan di chayiv azrikas dam b'chutz. From where do we know in general that a person is chayiv on throwing the blood outside the Beis HaMikdash? Hashchita v'halah hu dechsivan. We only see written in the pasuk, as we just saw, we only have examples of slaughtering outside the Beis HaMikdash or offering it up outside the Beis HaMikdash, offering the sacrifice, but we don't see anything about the zrika, about the throwing of the blood. So the Gemara is asking, where is the source for that? And the Gemara says, in Nafkalemi Detanya, we learned it out from the following brisa, Dom Yechashev. The pasuk is, the full pasuk over here says, V'al Pesach ol Moed lo Hevio. Again, he doesn't bring it to the entrance of the Beis HaMikdash. L'hakriv karban l'Hashem l'fnei Mishkan Hashem. Dom Yechashev lo Ishahu Dam Shafach v'nichras ha'Ishahu mekarav amo. The pasuk is referring to the fact that the person is then guilty, and so we learn from that l'rabos hazorek, that comes to include somebody who throws the blood outside the Beis HaMikdash. Divrei Rabbi Yishmael. These are the words of Rabbi Yishmael. Rabbi Akiva Omer. Rabbi Akiva says from a different pasuk. It says O Zavach. It says O Zavach, and that's extra. L'rabo says hazorek. That comes to include the person who throws the blood. And the Gemara continues, Rabbi Yishmael, Hi O Zavach, my Ovidle. What does Rabbi Yishmael do with O Zavach? And the Gemara says l'chalik. That's to distinguish. Again, the pasuk finishes over there, Asher Yala Ola O Zavach, and it means to say either or. It doesn't mean both. That's what it means, O Zavach. Rabbi Akiva l'chalik minoli, and Rabbi Akiva, where does he know to divide it, to say that it means either or? Nafkale, so he learns that out, Milo Yevienu, he learns that out from the pasuk Lo Yevienu. That's again the same pasuk we quoted, V'al Pesach ol Moed Lo Yevienu. Rabbi Yishmael says that pasuk of Lo Yevienu, Hahumi Boile, that's needed for the following, Al Hasholem Hu Chayiv, he's Chayiv on that which is whole, Ve'eno Chayiv ala Chasri, he's not Chayiv on that which is missing. For Rabbi Akiva Nafkale, now Rabbi Akiva learns that out, Milasos Oso, from the pasuk says, again, the same pasuk says Lasos Oso, the pasuk says Lasos Oso, Lashem V'nichras Ha'isha Hu Me'amov. Rabbi Yishmael, and Rabbi Yishmael says, Chad l'mukterei pnim, one pasuk is for that which is fit to be burned inside, shechasr, which is missing, v'helu b'chutz, and is offered outside, v'chad l'mukterei chutz, and one is for that which is fit to be burned outside, shechasr, which again is missing, v'helu b'chutz, and is offered up outside. And Rashi explains, Rabbi Yishmael's source again was Dam Yechashev, Dam Shafach, L'Rabos as Hazorek. That pasuk of Dam Yechashev comes to include the one who throws the blood, that again there's a liability in that case when it's outside of the Beis HaMikdash. V'hai kroi b'shchutei chutz ksivi, and these psukim, or this pasuk is written by shchutei chutz, again by slaughtering outside the Beis HaMikdash. And then Rabbi Akiva's source, O Zevach, it says in the pasuk, O Zavach ksiv, that's written in the pasuk, Gabi Halo, that's written by offering up the carbon. O l'rabos as hazorek, and here Rabbi Akiva is learning from the word O. The word O is coming to include again one who throws the blood. And the Gemara said the other way to understand the word O is l'chalik, that it's to divide, meaning the lo tema ad demasik ola ushlamim. One might think that the person has to offer up both an ola and a shlamim, and the O is saying it's either or. And the Gemara then said lo yevienu from the pasuk of lo yevienu mashmachad. That already is mashma. That already is understood to just mean one of the karbonos. And then the Gemara said vieno chayiv ala choser. One is not chayiv if it is missing. What does that mean? Rashi explains lekamon pligi bo. Later on, they're going to argue about this. Ikolaman damar al aver choser. One says that it's talking about a situation where the animal is missing a limb. Ve'ikolaman damar al behemo chasera ad sheyale kol habehema. And some say that it means, let's say the behema is missing, meaning you have to offer up the entire animal. Ve'ikolaman damar, and there's another mandamar that says al haktara chasera. Let's say the burning is insufficient. Kagon pachas mikazayis, for example, it is less than a kazayis. Oso, in the word oso, sholem mashma, that is mashma. It's understood to mean sholem, again, that it cannot be chaser. And finally, Rashi says, again, according to Rabbi Yishmael, you need both psukim, lo yevienu, and also lasos oso. You need them chad lemuktrei pnim. One is for a situation where it was fit to be burned inside the Beis HaMikdash, and again, it's chaser. And the other is for outside the Beis HaMikdash. And Rashi explains, the kasav chad, if you just had one pasuk, hav amina, then one might have thought, hani mili muktrei chutz. That's only true if it was fit to be burned outside the Beis HaMikdash, that if it's chaser, there we say that the person is not chayiv. Avol muktrei pnim, but let's say it was fit to be burned inside the Beis HaMikdash, and again, it was chaser and it was burned outside the Beis HaMikdash, so mechayiv. So one would think that in that case, one would be chayiv. And why would we say that? To hamadrinan poken de chasru al mahaktari, because we see that you have to return. Let's say it gets dislodged from the mizbeach. There's a concept of returning it. So you see that's called a haktara. That's called a burning. And so then one might have thought chayiv. That's why you need both psukim according to Rabbi Yishmael. And the Gemara continues and says, V'hatanya, we have a brisa that supports this approach within Rabbi Yishmael. The brisa says, Rabbi Yishmael says, Yochol mukterei pnim shechasru v'helu b'chutz. One might think that if it's fit to be burned inside and then it is missing and it is offered up outside the Beis HaMikdash, one might think chayiv, one might think liable. Talmud Lomer, the pasuk says lasos oso. Again, it says lasos oso. Al hasholim chayiv, eno chayiv al chaser. One is chayiv if it's whole, in terms of, again, offering it up outside the Beis HaMikdash, but not if it is chaser, not if it is missing. Now, Rabbi Akiva, why doesn't he use the two psukim for this purpose, for these two types of scenarios of mukterei pnim and mukterei chutz? The Gemara says, Rabbi Akiva, mukterei pnim shechasru v'helu b'chutz chayiv. Rabbi Akiva actually holds that mukterei pnim, if it was fit to be burned inside and then it's missing and then it's offered up outside the Beis HaMikdash, one is actually liable. And the Gemara continues, Rabbi Akiva, Hai dam yechashev ma'avidle. What does Rabbi Akiva do with the pasuk of dam yechashev? Again, that's what Rabbi Yishmael used to teach that zrika outside of the Beis HaMikdash, one is liable. Rabbi Akiva uses that pasuk l'rabo shchita sa'of to include slaughtering a bird. Let's say that's slaughtered outside of the Beis HaMikdash, that one is liable. Normally, the way a bird is offered in the Beis HaMikdash is through malika, through the pinching of the neck. And here we're saying that slaughtering the bird that was supposed to be a carbon outside of the Beis HaMikdash, there's a liability from this pasuk. Rabbi Yishmael nafkali, now Rabbi Yishmael learns that out. Shchita sa'of, he learns it out from me'o asher yishachet, from the pasuk of o asher yishachet. That comes to include shchita sa'of. For Rabbi Akiva Amar Lachan, Rabbi Akiva says to you, hahumi boy lay, that this pasuk of o asher yishachet, that's needed for the following: that al hashochet hu chayev, that again on slaughtering the bird outside the mikdash one is chayev. Velo al hamolek, but if one does malika outside the Beis HaMikdash to the bird, there is no liability. For Rabbi Yishmael nafkali mi zeh hadavar, Rabbi Yishmael learns that out from zeh hadavar. Zeh hadavar teaches again that it only applies to shchita sa'of, not malika sa'of. The Tanya, as we learned in a brisa, asher yishachet, it says in the pasuk asher yishachet. Ein li ela shochet behema. I only know if you slaughter an animal outside the Beis HaMikdash that there's liability. Shachet of menolan. Where do we know if he slaughters a bird? Talmud Lomar o asher yishachet. The pasuk says o asher yishachet. That comes to include the slaughtering of a bird. Yachol af hamolek. Now one might think even if one does malika outside the Beis HaMikdash, and that's even logical. V'dinu, it would be a logical argument. Mashchita dein derech hechsheira b'fnim chayev. If by shchita, which is not even the way that a person offers a bird inside the Beis HaMikdash, that's not the proper method in the Beis HaMikdash, because there you have to do malika. And if there you're chayev, if you do shchita outside the mikdash, so malika, when it comes to the pinching of the neck, shed derech hechsheira b'fnim, that's the proper way to offer the bird in the Beis HaMikdash. So eino din shu chayev, isn't it logical to say he'd be liable if he does it that way outside the Beis HaMikdash? Talmud Lomar zeh hadavar. The pasuk says zeh hadavar, to say again that it's true by shochet, but it's not true by molek. For Rabbi Akiva Amar Lachan, Rabbi Akiva says to you, ahumi boy lei l'gzeira shava, that actually the zeh hadavar needs to be used for something else. It's used for a gzeira shava in a different Mesechta. Rashi explains l'gzeira shava. He uses the zeh hadavar for a gzeira shava mefureshes b'yesh nochel, and that gzeira shava is explained in yesh nochel in Baba Basra, uven nedarim in Perak Basra, and also explained in Meseches nedarim. And the Gemara continues and asks, "V'hadetnan, but what about that which we learned in the Mishnah later on? Hakometz v'hamekabel domim b'chutz. If somebody does kmitza by a karban mincha, or he receives the blood outside of the Beis Hamikdash, Potter, in those cases, one is exempt. Minolan, from where do we know that there's an exemption in those situations? The Gemara asks on that, well, why would we even think, what's the source to be chayiv in those cases? The Gemara says to that, Teisi mishchita, we might have thought to be chayiv, because we can learn from shchita. Because just like by shchita we say outside the mikdash is liable, so to komitz and makabel damim. But the Gemara says you can't learn from shchita. Ma'ala shchita shekein nefseles shelo la'ochlin b'pesach. Shchita is unique, because there's a disqualification. Let's say it's slaughtered by karban pesach, not for the people who are supposed to be eating it. That's a particular halacha by shchita, and so therefore you can't really learn from shchita. The Gemara says, well, teisim is zrika. Well, why don't we learn from zrika? But zrika is also unique. Mal is zrika shekein zar chayev ala misa. What's unique about zrika is that a non-kohen is chayev. If he does the zrika, he's chayev misa. And Rashi explains, hakometz mincha b'chutz. Let's say somebody does the kmitza, that's taking the fistful of the karban mincha outside the Beis Hamikdash, v'lo hekter, but doesn't burn it. So Potter, he's exempt. Minole de Potter, from where do we know that he's Potter? Uparchinan mehei teisi l'chiyuva ditztra chrolam iftrei. The Gemara asks, well, why should we say chayev, that we wouldn't even need a pasuk to say Potter? And the Gemara said, Ma'ala shchita shekein poselas b'pesach sheshachta shelo la'ochlav. Shelo la'ochlin, when it comes to shchita, it's disqualified if it's shelo la'ochlin, meaning, kagon l'chol of hizakin. For example, let's say one would slaughter karban pesach for someone who's sick, or for someone who's elderly, shein yachol lechol kazayis, somebody who can't eat a kazayis. K'dichsiv ish l'fi achlo tachosu, like it says, ish l'fi achlo tachosu, has to be someone who can eat. Tomer bekometz mincha de lo shayich psul shelo la'ochlav. There it's not even relevant by the kometz of the mincha, such a disqualification. Kabbalah nami afilu b'pesach, by receiving blood, even by the karban pesach lo mifsala, that's not a disqualification. Keda'amrim b'perek tav nishchat, that's what we say in Meseches Psachim in tav nishchat. Rabbi Yomer loshen sorsi huzeh kadam shomer kosli telezed de v'shchita lechuda hu de pasla machsheves ochlin. It's only by shchita that we have this disqualification. Teisim is Zrika, let's learn from Zrika. The lo paslo shelo l'shem ochlin b'Pesach. Again, you don't have that disqualification of lo l'shem ochlin on Pesach, u'mechayiv ala b'chutz, and again, there's a liability outside the Beis HaMikdash by Zrika. V'uadin l'kmitza v'Kabbalah. One might think that should be true by kmitza and Kabbalah as well. And the Gemara said to that, shekein zar chayiv ala misa. That's unique also, because a zar is chayiv misa, ma she'en kein b'kmitza v'Kabbalah. Now that's not true by the kometz and by the receiving of the blood. T'va'inon avoda tama, the halacha of zar chayiv ala misa is by the avoda tama, meaning where the avoda is complete. V'lo avoda sheyesh acharei avoda, not in avoda where there's going to be another avoda that follows. Kedamrinon perak rishona b'seder yuma, like we say in the first parak of Mesechet Yuma. V'hani tarvayo yesh acharei avoda. When it comes to these two, meaning when it comes to kmitza and Kabbalah, there is avoda after that, and we will continue with this discussion in the next video on Daf Zayin Amud Beis.